Guten Abend.
Good evening. I'm Laila Atzebaidi. I'm chairing the international department of the foundation. I'm very happy that you are here, and a warm welcome to everybody online and in this room. So we already were afraid that we would have sunshine tonight, but we are now very happy that the sky is still gray. So I just briefly would like to announce a little change in our program. Unfortunately, Stefan Detjen could not be with us because he is accompanying Chancellor Merz at his trip to the USA. That's, of course, we cannot compete with that, of course, but we are very happy that Christine Hierberg has agreed to come to us. Thank you for that. And, of course, a big thank you to all our guests and panelists. But before really welcoming you properly, and also before I hand over to our chair, Philipp Albrecht, I would also like to thank Issa Reh, who organized this evening in our office. And I would also like to thank our interpreters in advance. Thank you. They will make sure that this event can also be followed in English. So let me hand over. Thank you, Leila. Thanks to you as well. A warm welcome, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, at Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung Foundation. I'm Jan-Philipp Albrecht, one of the chair people in the foundation, and I would like to welcome you warmly to speak about the future of international law at a time where it is really appropriate to speak about the future of international law and the situation it is in. It is everywhere. We are discussing it at many points. What is the value of international law at all? Do multilateral institutions also have still an importance? And how can we contribute that people abide by its rules? So it's almost 80 years ago when the Charter of the United Nations was signed. There is also a reason to speak about it. And there has always been efforts recently to change the future of international order and institutions of the UN, to develop it further and also to increase application of international law. But we have to see in these times it's very difficult, both reforming the UN and also by imposing international law at a time where we have still to experience that in the neighborhood of Europe, a war of aggression of Russia is being waged against international law, against the prohibition of aggression, at a time where, for instance, we also can see in Gaza where international law is also violated both by Hamas with their atrocious crimes against humanity and also by the Israel army in the name of their defense against this attack, where one has to say clearly that preventing or depriving people of aid or of food is the same like the occupational politics of Israel in the West Jordan. It's a hint that international law is violated, and this needs to be addressed in all those cases. It takes a discussion about how the value of international law can be put to the foreground more, and what strategy we might find in order to bring this subject back on the agenda, namely that this is the strength of the rule of law rather than the right of the stronger or the lack of right which is prevailing. And this is what we are going to discuss tonight. We are both trying to find strategies. We want to address the challenges for international law. We want to take a look at its situation. We want to look at alliances between countries, governments, but also players in the civil society. And we want to find out how we can make sure to also continue these achievements which we learned in the past, also as an experience from wars and other situations. I'm very happy that we could combine a very high-ranking panel tonight, and I would like to thank Mr. Wolfgang Michalek, Boris Mikhailowicz, Hanina Dill, and Christian Hellberg. I'm also very happy and looking forward to the discussion. And now I would like to listen to the words of Volker Türk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who, for lack of time, cannot be with us tonight. But he sent us a statement, and we are now going to listen to his statement before we are starting the discussion. And thanks for having you. And have a good evening.
I send my warm regards to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation and everyone who participates in this very important discussion on international law. In recent years, we've been seeing more and more crisis and bloodshed. The terrible and at the same time avoidable suffering of civilian populations in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, and many other places exacerbated partly by the blockade of aid supplies for civilian populations, but of course also because of the terrible bombings of hospitals. This causes severe damage in entire regions, and that will have an impact for generations to come. The denial of climate change and the obstruction of progress in replacing fossil fuels with renewable energies leads to massive human rights violations. There's an increasing spread of movements who call for so-called male dominance and white supremacy, and that harms millions of people. But these movements are also destroying the equality ladders that lead to more equal opportunities, more opportunities for a fairer society and a thriving economy for all. If the many potential risks of artificial intelligence will not be addressed and regulated, this could lead to risks and dangers that we do not yet fully understand in terms of their nature and extent. We should loudly and consistently call for accountability and binding regulations and their implementation when it comes to law, justice, the rule of law, and human rights obligations. But instead, the credibility or even the relevance of international law is undermined and called into question. Therefore, it is all the more important that governments stand up consistently for international law. The International Criminal Court, for example, is under fire, and that also comes from the most powerful states. Interim measures of the International Court in connection with the Genocide Convention, which are legally binding, are just pushed aside, neglected. Disarmament treaties and the Paris Climate Agreement are undermined by the very states that have initially negotiated them. In other words, more and more governments disregard and openly distance themselves from international norms and legal frameworks. Tonight's question concerns the future of international law. Does it even have a future? I am convinced that it indeed does have a future. And let me be clear, international law works. Strong and credible law is essential for cross-border cooperation in all areas of life, and only in this way we can solve global problems. All over the world, people rely on international law so that they can reliably solve real problems and create security. Airplanes fly safely, medicines work reliably, and are being tested for risks. The ozone layer is recovering. Vans from all over the world can come to us through long, complex supply chains. Girls must not be forcefully married. Boys and girls must not be sent to war. Recent progress on major global agreements show that most states still have confidence in international law. I therefore welcome the adoption of a global agreement on pandemics, and I urge states to swiftly advance negotiations, for example, on the Treaty on Crimes Against Humanity, or, for instance, the UN Plastics Treaty. Despite fierce opposition, international courts Hybrid tribunals and national courts continue to advocate for international law, both in terms of criminal responsibility for atrocities committed and the responsibility of states for human rights violations on climate issues and many other international legal issues of our present day. This consistent and principled application of the law must be supported much more strongly and must be protected and promoted by national courts. Here I welcome the progress made by the German judiciary when they applied the International Criminal Code and its principles of universal jurisdictions on crimes in Syria, Gambia, and Iraq. The United Nations human rights inquiries also continuously provide evidence and analysis that can lead to criminal responsibility and other forms of accountability. My office currently leads or supports complex and comprehensive investigations on human rights situations in 12 countries. We also monitor the human rights situation in the rest of the world through our approximately 90 offices around the globe and together with independent human rights experts from the UN. Throughout human history, throughout centuries of civilization, we have learned that without rule and laws, chaos and destruction reigns. The strong do as they please, while the weak will be marginalized and oppressed, ultimately leading to impoverishment and insecurity for all. The history of human rights is marked by people who have fought against cruelty, corruption, and destabilizing arbitrary rule by gradually establishing fairer standards that do not only protect human dignity and promote justice, but also guarantee stability. But today, respect for international law is increasingly being eroded. We must, of course, resolutely oppose this. It is time for our governments and our generations, young and old, to stand up together for international law and demand accountability wherever it is flouted. This means clearly and consistently rejecting the idea that countries can simply disregard the rules and do as they please, even if these countries are allies. It also means defending international law vigorously and consistently and applying it equally everywhere. It means protecting and supporting the principled work of international legal institutions, even when this work sometimes leads to uncomfortable conclusions. It means political support, public and civil society engagement, and above all, financial support. Europe in general, and Germany in particular, are among the strongest supporters of international law. I therefore urge you to become more active, both politically and financially. Last year, for example, there were drastic cuts in official development aid in many countries, including in Europe. My office is also facing a funding shortfall of at least $60 million. The impact of such a budget deficit on human rights and international stability could be very serious. The impact of such a budget deficit could be serious, and defending human rights and upholding the law prevents crisis. It is crisis prevention. Our work is an investment in a peaceful and sustainable future. At this juncture in world history, we need far more active support. We must not allow the protective shield of international law and human rights to be reduced to rubble.
Kein Problem, ich habe hier meine Sitzordnung.
Okay, I have a seating order. A warm welcome to everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to Heinrich-Böll Foundation. International law is everywhere and now in everybody's mouth, and like never before it is being quoted, especially by NGOs, by media, also by politicians. Even the German Chancellor is also now speaking of limits of humanitarian law, which is violated in Gaza, and experts of international law long since have not just been writing essays, but they're also calling upon the German government. They are sitting in talk shows, they explain exactly the crimes and where they are committed, and have become crown witnesses of the current crisis and conflicts everywhere, even when you need somebody to name things and whenever you want to speak about rule of law, you get somebody who is knowledgeable in international law, and this is very good for this evening as well. But all this talking about international law doesn't have any impact on what's happening in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Myanmar, in Sudan, and that is why we actually have to deal with a big conflict. A contradiction. Everybody is talking about international law, but no one is respecting it, just briefly. Or hardly anyone is respecting it. But what's the reason for that? Of course, it's a question of implementation. International law does not implement itself in its own right. It has to be implemented by people. But is it that there is a new order in the world which has been showing up already for years, but is now getting more impetus under Trump's government, where a lot of uncertainty is around in the world, and a lot of incalculable matters, because alliances are being called into question, and the question is now who actually is going to be an ally of whom, and who is able to become an ally. And there is an impression already right now that the right of the stronger is worth more today than the strength of the right or the rule of law. So what Mr. Turk has been warning of, this protection shield of the international system based on rules of law and agreements, which actually has been protecting all of us and is supposed to support all of us as civilians, is that can we still uphold it, and how can that happen? That's what we are going to discuss tonight. First, we are going to do so in this panel for 1 hour and a quarter, and then, of course, there is more time to answer your questions and to discuss with you personally. My 4 guests, the panelists, are not just experts in the matter, they are also highly committed in international law in one way or the other. Wolfgang Kralik is a lawyer for human rights and an author. In 2007, he founded the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights in Berlin, which he is now also chairing as the General Secretary. The ECCHR is worldwide striving for human rights, amongst other things, by launching claims against companies or governments who are violating international law. Welcome. Heike Krieger is also here since 2006. She's a professor for public law and international law at the Free University of Berlin. Her main focus is humanitarian international law and the protection of people's or human rights. Warm welcome, Heike. Boris Mijatovic, since 2021, has been in parliament for the Green Party. He is also an ombudsman in the Committee for International Law, where he is also fighting for international law and for strengthening international institutions in that area. A warm welcome, Boris Mijatovic. And Janina Dill is also with us. You can see her on screen at the far end of this panel. Hello, I'm happy to have you here online. She's a professor for international security at the Lovatnik School of Government at the Oxford University and co-director of the Oxford Institute for Ethnic Law and Armed Conflicts. She's also working on international law, on the role of the right and moral, and on the subject of international security. A warm welcome, Janina Dill. First question. So why are we talking so much about international law? Is that because it's so important, because it deserves so much attention, or is it just because no one is actually respecting it right now? Is it right on the downturn? Is it about to fall into forgetfulness? That is a bit hard. But is it now on the rise or on the fall? Ms. Krieger, perhaps you want to take the floor first. What is your take on that? Well, I think the fact that so much is being said about international law shows that international order is in a crisis. There's a lot of reason to remember us of the limits of state actions and to speak about very fundamental standards. And so this should be upheld, and we can also observe that international law, in contrast to other value orders, which could also be taken as a reference when you want to criticize or making reference to Gaza war. So at least the basic idea, there is already an agreement between governments, which is this framework which gives us a language to speak about atrocities, for example. Mr. Kalek, what do you think are the present threats to international law? You have been in this business for quite a time, and you have had experience with attacks also on non-governmental organizations by the media, for example. So, but what is the acute threat for you right now? Well, the major threat right now is that the crisis of international law is not being looked at from the historic point of view. It is the promise of which we have in the Charter of Human Rights and the other conventions, which actually have never been implemented. Like Volker Türk, we can of course say what all the standards are, but any right is only as good as it is implemented in practice. And when we look at it like that, it has been in crisis for a long time already, because it's used selectively, especially by the strong governments of the West. And secondly, because this unfulfilled promise to decolonize the colonized countries, in other words, to establish a new world order, an economic world order in 1945 in a UN resolution that has been proclaimed and has never been observed by the Western countries since February 2020, when Russia attacked Ukraine, since October 23, and also by the recent attacks of Trump government. But this is nothing new. International law has always been in crisis. The world has never been okay. Those who are now saying that the world is in disorder, they can only say so because they have lived in very privileged and comfortable conditions. While in other countries there were authoritarian regimes, there was poverty, there was hunger, etc. And so let me say that is also why we are somewhat hardened in that respect, and we did not lose our spirit and we did not lose our courage, because the US have never been a guardian of the rule-based order, or whatever you may call it. And this is now again showing that they are now taking the position of being exempt from everything. And this is also why the other non-governmental organizations have to oppose that. Whether Germany is a custodian of international law remains to be seen. But now the selective imposition of international right. Only certain crimes are being prosecuted, and only if certain perpetrators are committing them, while the perpetrators, especially in Western countries, European countries, or the US, are mainly saved by impunity. So what what consequences does that have? What does it do to the people and their belief in international law, but also what does it do to international security? I would like to elaborate on that again, that the idea that we have always been in kind of a crisis in international law, especially when it comes to armed conflicts and the crisis we see now. Because in international law we have long been talking about the crisis of the population, and that's not coming as a surprise, because when countries attack each other, they are already in a state of exceptions, and the population is always under pressure. And we see this, of course, also in the parties at war, in the present conflicts, which have our attention, for instance, in Ukraine, Gaza, and Sudan, where international law is violated thoroughly. But the core of the crisis is much more than such a population crisis. It's the crisis of the answer by third-party countries, and Germany has to play a very pronounced role in that, because we know that from political science that the idea of a player is very important in such situations. If Germany sticks to the rule of law, and if that's a consistent move, so that they are saying yes to the legal framework when it's about the crimes committed by Russia, but when they turn a blind eye to the crimes committed by Israel, then this fairness will be disarmed. Well, so why it's so important, for instance, if we have a Green foreign minister who has called for a feminist foreign policy, if they are speaking about an epidemic of and justifying the attacks on hospitals, etc., she can, of course, cause much more damage than President Trump or Viktor Orbán, who right from the onset have positioned themselves against the rule of law. So we do not see the typical crisis of not complying with international law by parties at war or by parties who do not have any interest in complying with international law. But we have a crisis of countries such as Germany, US, or the United Kingdom, who are selectively imposing this right, and this is not just hidden, it is just a program of their politics, and the effects of that on rule-based order are much more detrimental than just denying the rule of law and international law. Of course, thank you. We are now continuing with the politician, Mijatovic. A clear criticism if players who actually are pretending that they are fighting for international law, and they are, by using it selectively, they are actually causing damage to this idea. So how important is that in your work at the Bundestag, in the light of all these political considerations, to impose trust in international law, not just by abiding by these rules, but also by imposing it also against your own allies? That's, of course, being shaken, especially when it comes to the Gaza war. So do you really see this, that this is used as an argument, or is it something which you would rather leave to the lawyers because you would be afraid to be nailed down to some positions which you do not want to defend?
Well, that's the basic principle of law, that you deal within you act within a framework that is clearly defined. That's the principle of a rule-based order. That's the basic principle of the United Nations. And of course, when we look at the Charter of United Nations and what is being done in practice, we all know what happened in the Security Council with the 5 permanent members that determine the world order as they please. But I also would like to respond to the accusation against the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I think that's not fair. Of course, Germany has a prominent role when it comes to relations with Israel, so there are many expectations. And I'm not saying that because she was my Minister of Foreign Affairs, but I greatly respect the work done by Annalena Baerbock and her team in Israel. Maybe not everybody has seen it outside. And what did she achieve? Well, we have talked a lot about trucks and lorries and how many of them will be allowed in. We talked a lot about open access. We criticized right from the start that the temporary port built by the Americans cannot be upheld and costs too much money. And we also talked about dual-use goods and medical supplies. Of course, I know the scene that you related to. It was a public statement, and of course that created the suspicion that we are giving up principles that belong to our core identity. I don't see that. I'd like to, or maybe you just tell me what the statement was all about. Maybe I just haven't heard it. Let's come back to that. Ms. Baerbock talked a lot. There's no denying that. And of course, well, it was not just talking. We all understand that the attitude of the last government and the current government is to stay in touch, to discuss with Israel, because with publicly hard statements, you're not getting anywhere. Now, 20 months into the military operation in Gaza, the question is, have we achieved anything? Or does the current government not want to listen to what the allies are telling it? Ms. Baerbock's statements, you may correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Dill. I think indirectly she justified attacks on hospitals that could then lose their protective status. And her statement was very unclear. As far as I know, you may only attack civilian buildings if there is an attack coming right out of that very object. So if that civilian object is being clearly used as a military place, this is my amateurish understanding of the principle. But you also wanted to say something about this issue. I mean, if hospitals are being abused as military objects, if a command is set up there, then they lose their civilian protected state. That's provided for in the Geneva Convention. But of course, then we still have the proportionality principle and the precautionary principle. That is to say, you cannot bomb everything. So the status as such, the legal status of an object abused for military purposes changes, but you cannot do everything you want to. Let me come back to the question of where are we? Are we in a normal crisis or is everything different today? I'd like to go back to what Ms. Dill said. I think the U.S. behavior under Trump's government can no longer be seen as American exceptionalism. This is a principal attack on the rule of law. We see it inside the United States, and we also see it in international relations. It's now different from what it was like during the first Trump administration. It is not just withdrawing from international treaties. It is also calling into question the principle of a ban on violence. Even the Iraq war was still justified with legal arguments. It's no longer being done nowadays. Legal principles are no longer any guiding principle for the actions of the U.S. government. In terms of quality, that's a completely new challenge. And even if you look at international law, the basic function, a common language, and creating a common framework, this common language for all is no longer being used, the language of international law. It's a fundamental challenge. Mr. Karlik, what is the impact on other actors in international order? Well, it does have an impact, of course. Ms. Krieger, I do agree and disagree at the same time. You also talked about the erosion of the international law before 7th of October and before Trump. Trump has not yet attacked a country against international law. The Bush government did it in Iraq. 1 million people deceased. Genocide of the Yazidi population. And Trump has not yet set up a systematic system of torture against suspects with torture hotspots all across the globe. So I think we are ignoring history there. I mean, in the old days, they have quickly decided anti-terror laws to justify that. Putin does it too, and so does Erdogan. I mean, these are the impact. If some people say with dubious legal arguments that torture is not torture and that certain persons would be excluded from the ban on torture, then the Chinese are saying in the German-Chinese dialogue, what are you talking about, ban on torture? Few have and support Guantanamo. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin, or the question for me is, well, I'm not sure, and nobody knows exactly what will happen in terms of actions against the international criminal courts. We just have one suspended judge on the list of suspects. The abuse of power is one of the accusations. So he's on the list. We do not know, are we going to see more attacks on the United Nations? And for me, I can say, what will happen if you withdraw funding? Then, of course, it's damage to international law. Is that just partly damage, or is it going to be a damage that is final and fatal? And you talked about common language. It's already a progress.
Innerhalb der deutschen Juristen-Community
When we look at the discussions in legal circles in Germany, the legal experts were very clear about Ukraine and Gaza. Of course, Gaza, there was this attack on 7th of October, and then successively accusations for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and now some say it's genocide, some say it's not. But what we should criticize the German government for is this inconsistency in their behavior. When we look at Gambia and Myanmar, there we stood up for a wide interpretation of international law. In the case of Gaza, they say we should not interpret international law so widely. The whole world has seen these different standards. And South Africa, when applying to the International Criminal Court, that was really absolutely justified. Of course, there's criticism of double standards that is justified. But there, South Africa tried to use the law. And like you said in the beginning, it's like in Ukraine. Not much happened, but at the same time, a lot happened. What we have to do is look at international law and change our expectations. International law and international criminal law is not going to stop wars, but they are steps in the right direction. And of course, we must say in the last 25 years, we also have seen positive changes. And the implementation of international criminal law should prevent those in power from waging such wars. But let's take one step back. Why did it all start? Here, I have to agree. Maybe you say something about the inconsistency. Mr. Kalek said the international law experts have named all the different interpretations. How about this total discrepancy? How do you see that in Parliament? It's like a parallel world that we see in Parliament. This ignorance of the forms of crimes that are committed in Gaza. Let me go back to the last 20 or 30 years. The Rome Statute is a fairly young legal principle. And of course, we have not been able to prevent wars. Quite the opposite is true. Also, Putin has found a legal justification for its attack. He said there's a genocide happening in the east of Ukraine against the Russian population. So therefore, the use of international criminal law is there. Also, Hamas has used that, and it has become part of the war strategy. People hide behind international law, and Hamas hides in schools and in hospitals, and knowing that they have a civilian status and should not be attacked, and that is also an abuse. So it is not so easy for government to just, or parliament here in Germany, to come and say we know the answer to it all. We must make sure we do not send invitation to Benjamin Netanyahu, who is against whom we have a warrant of arrest. There was this invitation, it won't happen again, but it's not yet forgotten. And it's also a sign of double standards that we are sending out into the world. So we do not have to define the legal implications. We do have a couple of problems that are evident at first glance. When I criticize the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I was not just talking about one statement. The previous Minister of Foreign Affairs had a certain pattern. Time and again, she insisted on the applicability of law, and she also said we are concerned about the facts. And then this government refused to subsume where they put together facts and the law, where indeed we said Israel is violating the law, and it is shameful, especially in the context of very controversial armament weapon exports, in the context of the very hesitant reaction to the International Criminal Court the warrant of arrest against Netanyahu. The simultaneity of Gaza and Ukraine is so bad. It shows the double standards. It shows hypocrisy. In both cases, the German government managed to get different interpretations, both by the European Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Both courts have also done work against Israel, and Germany does not support this. These are facts. These are actions. And the discourse that creates a picture that we are not compliant and in conformity with international law anymore. I mean, the question of Netanyahu, would he be arrested if he came to Germany? And the question of weapon exports, it's a consistency in German politics that both in discourse and in action, Israel is not being criticized and not called upon to apply, to respect international law. It's a devastating situation for German diplomacy and international relations. What do you think should be the things that the governments in Germany would now have to do to restore credibility? First of all, we need a change of policy. Also, based on the Genocide Convention, we should impose an embargo on weapon exports against Israel. We should have done that in Germany long ago because it's a question of whether a genocide has been committed or not. Here, Germany should clearly support the majority position of Germany and should also vote in favor of sanctions and should use all diplomatic means in order to influence Israel as much as we can. And this is also something that was postulated by the International Court of Justice. The court says all legal means must be used in order to exercise influence. And here Germany does not do enough. We need more than a policy change. Maybe we can talk about it later. It's a political failure that we have seen, and that also is a failure of society at large. And we need a self-reflection first and foremost. Our government would have to change its policy.
Mr. Krieger, what do you think against the background of this decision, of this ruling of the International Court, whether it's a genocide or not, whether we want to call it a genocide already, but there is a clear statement of the court to take to do everything to prevent a genocide from happening. So you are obliged at least not to submit weapons. So what's the take of the government? What should they do in order to be more credible? Well, I share the view of Ms. Still as regards the directions, also in the proceedings between Nicaragua and Germany, to continue checking whether supply of weapons is still admissible or whether it does not violate the prohibition of prevention. So the use of weapons can, of course, be called assistance in this genocide. So what was announced yesterday in the press, that's, of course, one of the results. It requires an open check of this. I'm neither the lawyer or the advocate of Israel, nor of the ex-foreign minister Annalena Baerbock, but just let us think politically what it means if we restrict weapon deliveries to Israel. We are actually hitting the government of Israel, and in the surrounding we still have governments who strive to delete Israel from the map. So if we start weakening or reducing our assistance to Israel now, what would happen then? Legally, it may all be correct, but even at the International Court of Justice, when you look at the decisions on Rafah, the 5 judges who, in a preliminary ruling, said that the offensive should be stopped, even there it was 3-2. And even then, there was one very fuzzy sentence, deliberately fuzzy, because they do not want to take this responsibility. And there is, of course, the limits of international law, because the question remains what's going to happen. Israel is still a country which is seen as an enemy by all the countries surrounding it. And it's actually not about anti-air missiles, but it's about tanks. and they are being used in Gaza. So actually we are claiming together with some Palestine inhabitants of Gaza for more than a year. We have been claiming against exports of armament at the administrative court in Berlin and Frankfurt, and we are declaring precisely that's about the weapons which are being used in Gaza, and that can be really nailed down to those weapons. Legally, that's very clear. And legally, we have long since been prone to being assisting a genocide. So what is that attitude like if we say in the federal parliament that we have to support them, and then the civil servants in the ministries and those who are dealing with these armament exports are actually being let down legally, because they all know there's a lot of discussion in this ministry, because everyone who's involved in this, and I'm not this is not conspiracy, but everyone who is taking part in weapons exports for which are determined for the war in Gaza is of course committing kind of assistance to this violation of international law. And I would also like to speak about these crimes against humanity. And of course, you should not just call it a genocide, because there is hardly any lawyer in international law who would not call it a war crime. And there is no. There are war crimes, there is genocide, and there are crimes against humanity. Of course, as an entrance card to the International Court of Justice, it's of course necessary, because Israel has signed the Genocide Convention. That's why it was the case that South Africa took that step as a door opener. But you have to just take it seriously. And let me come to your statement. Solidarity with the country of Israel is only should only be go so far as the international law is not violated against international. At the International Court of Justice, they are in charge of the most atrocious crimes against humanity, because the the community of states, the vast majority of states, have agreed to look at these crimes as crimes against humanity as a whole. And that's why there is this International Court of Justice. That's why we have this principle of international law. That's why a high court in Koblenz could judge the perpetrators of Syria, even though they had only committed torture in Syria. And in the future, this is not just going to happen to Israel suspects, but also to Germans. I'm forecasting that there are plenty of lawyers in the Netherlands, in Spain, in France, in Italy, who are already taking a look and will take a look at who is involved in all these deeds and who is the one we should call while on holiday, etc., and bring them to justice. We have seen this in the last 20 years, and we want to speak about the role of civil society actors later. So in the meantime, the networks have formed who have been formed late and are not sufficient, and this criticism is justified. We are always coming late. But something is happening. It's happening afterwards, and exactly that is why you, as a politician, have the responsibility to protect the people in this country, in these ministries, to not from committing those crimes. Let me just take one step back. And we have talked a lot about Gaza, but now let us just consider how did this international law come about? What is the reason? What is the origin of it? Why does it have such a high value in Germany, based on the historic responsibility of Germany for the crimes against of the Nazi dictatorship? So that is why we. So arguing with this historical responsibility and this responsibility again for the UN Charter, and Germany was took a very important part in the wording of the and formulation of the International Court of Justice. And a lot of people from Syria are very happy of the way how Germany is applying these rules. So what are actually the achievements of international law? Perhaps we can try to look back to the last decades in a positive way. Are there any things that have changed over time politically because we have this legal basis now after the Second World War? Have there other things which have been created thereby, which we now feel are just normal, or is it just a whole history of failure? No, it's not a history of failure, and it's not enough to say just we are having this historic responsibility. I think we are bound by international law because we know that it binds us ourselves and may protect us from ourselves. And I think that aspect, why different political conditions play a very important role in different contexts. And I think human rights, and Mr. Turk is very right, in spite of all the difficulties we have, human rights is a big achievement because it's a slide where political demands can be raised and reminding us that minorities need to be protected in a society which otherwise is just designed for majorities, and by giving the individual this possibility to stand out of its system and to rely on people who have a totally different perspective, maybe. So there is a real central control in order to expand the discussion a little bit. Something which I think is very concerning now is the letter of the 9 European states to the European Court of Justice. While they say that this understanding of human rights after the war does not play any role today, we have to re-understand and redefine human rights today. And actually that's going totally against human rights, and it's an extreme threat also within Europe to human rights. And to me, it's also a sign that the quality of attacks has changed. And that's also what I'm saying, because it's so important to fight for this. And it's about documents as well. The European Convention of Human Rights, which is now going to be rewritten, UN right, which is going to be reworded, etc. Ms. Still, what do you think, also from the historic point of view, but not only when looking to Gaza, what's the result of the achievement of Germany with regard to international law over the last decades? So, of course, we thank the prohibition of violence and the Geneva Convention and this is all owed to the new powers after the Second World War. But I would also agree that our link to international law cannot just be reduced to that, because it's very important that we need also this protection for stable trade relationships, for avoiding conflicts, for safeguarding human rights, and for protecting certain groups. All that can only happen under the protection of the rule of law. And in the context of a political community like Germany, it's not different like in the international context. And that's, to me, the reason for this importance of sticking to the rule of law in international law. And there is also this risk if you question this in your international politics, in your foreign politics, and if you allow this to happen. Of course, in Germany we are not that far like in the US, where they are questioning this rule of law very openly. But when you look at the German results in foreign policy, you have to say we have to defend, we have to nip it in the bud. We have to generally, of course, societies have also their internal solution solving principles, and they will also reflect this to the outside world. But that's also happening to the US. They had to see this after their war on terror, and Israel has to see this, and also we have to discuss it. But if you admit the break of rule of law and international law, that's of course detrimental to society as a whole. And this is one reason why the balance sheet of German politics, especially against the background of the simultaneousness of the war in Gaza and the Ukraine war, it makes me so concerned. There is hardly any room to maneuver for questioning, for asking questions in that. So we cannot just leave Israel unprotected, but law is not working that way. No one has the right to commit war crimes, even in defense of its rights. So we would also not say that against the occupation you are entitled to commit war crimes. What we have to do is against the needs of Israel, of course, and we have to uphold good relationships with Israel. And if This is, of course, also our means to influence on Israel. You really should put Israel to the choice that we say, okay, we can support your right of existence, but within this legal framework, because your exercise of defense is legal, and we will support your weapons if you really stick to the rule of law. So we just do not let down Israel, and I do not believe that just giving up legality in Germany would be helpful in that, because this would also be done in favor of a player who also is violating and undermining the rule of law inside Israel. The people in Israel, which also would need our solidarity because they want to protect these values also under very difficult conditions. This is the civil society there. So we can really do justice to our historic responsibility by upholding these values without just protecting a prime minister who is right-wing radical and he's undermining democracy in its own country and who is also committing atrocities and crimes against humanity. I would like to pass on to Mr. Mijatovic, because that's a big question. Again, we have ended up in Gaza and Israel, I'm sorry to say, but we are going to dig a little bit deeper, questioning who are actually our allies in this international law and in this light of this International Court of Justice and the government of Trump, who is just going away from that, in the light of right-wing populism inside Europe, who are trying to putting its axe to asylum law and looking at the right-wing national religious messianic government in Israel, which is clearly also forming alliances with Viktor Orbán's and others. I mean, those are forces which we also fight internally, and we from the Greens and Mr. Merz is even saying that we do not do anything together with the AfD. But then we have Israel, where the government is doing exactly that, what our internal enemies are doing. I'm not the advocate, but you have to explain this politically. I'm not the advocate of Annalena Baerbock. No, it's not about her anymore. There's one concrete question. The civil society in Israel, they are just waiting for German politics, which is consistently telling the government, can you please support us, and not just stabbing us in the back, because they see that democracy is also at risk in Israel. Those are actually our allies who are now rallying inside Israel. Yes, and that's exactly also happening as regards lawmaking in Israel, that these civil organizations are now coming under fire. So I was there, I spoke to Gisha, I was standing together, breaking the silence. I was in Hebron, I was in the West Bank. I know the violence by the settlers. I know about the crimes which are committed there. But again, so what do your Israel partners tell you? Thank you for the last 20 months of green foreign policy. Thank you, it is polemic. So you can be populist, of course, but you know those people. But it's the seriousness of the question. It's not about the drama of being not protected, but the signal. If the allied countries such as Germany is putting this sign, and this is something which we are now discussing currently, and I was there last year, and I spoke about this subject last year, and last year the mood about this subject was totally different. So I have the feeling that now I'm all of a sudden on the other side, which may be okay, but I did not say leaving Israel unprotected, but the signal to the region is something which we should not leave out of sight. Now let me give you another example. The Council of Human Rights. When I listened to Volker Türk, actually I was really shocked to hear him saying that the ship is now sinking. He is underfinanced. We have an undermining of the system of human rights by authoritarian countries, by governmental organized NGOs. And so we are massively under pressure with international law by authoritarian systems challenging us. And the answer cannot be that we just dismantle each other. And I'm not a defender of Netanyahu. On the contrary, I welcome the arrest warrants, and I worked at the ICC. It is not so easy to make a case. We have to have the elements for putting evidence on that, and it needs to be done. claims have been filed, but it's not been ruled yet. I don't know how the European Court of Justice are doing this. Of course, they will collect evidence now from South Africa. At the beginning, it was not so strong and massive like it is now. We also have to admit that. And that's something where in international law we should be a bit more careful in judging very carefully and not being cynical.
I'm sorry, I didn't want to be cynical. I just wanted to say that your partners in Israel might feel abandoned. Yes, just to exemplify. I know that you are having conversations with partners in Israel. And my question now goes to Mr. Kalek. You have many international links to international law experts. What is their perception of German politics? What's the perception of the consistency or the level of consistency of German policies? And, well, in March 2022, after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, I was in New York. And in October 2023, I was in New York. In both cases, I got the same reaction. New York at that time was a very vibrant city with scientists and scholars from all over the world. And they said, well, good you noticed that there are wars. Good for you to respond fastly. Why did you never respond when we had Ethiopia, Yemen, Iraq? Why don't you respond? Why do you only wake up when it's taking place in front of your doorstep and if it's in line with your interests? The question of weapons. The ICC filed a complaint against German armament companies for delivering weapons to Saudi Arabia because they use them to commit war crimes in Yemen. When the Greens were still in opposition, they said they are going to insist on a more transparent and restrictive arms exports system. It never happened. So, of course, the difficulty also has something to do with historical developments. Well, the German discourse is being received by many Jewish intellectuals. Jewish intellectuals in New York asked me in November 2023, what is Germany doing there? Half my friends working in human rights organizations are Jewish friends. They didn't understand what we were doing. You said, you usurped the right to talk in the name of so many people. I was at the opening of the Simon Schocken chain store. It's a publishing house. They had a publishing house in Germany where left Germany in 1933 and went to the United States. The grandsons from Israel were there. They are the owners and editors of El Haaretz, and they said, we have never seen such an attack against the freedom of the press. We have never, ever seen such an attack against us as an institutions. And when they heard who I am, and is it Michael Svard is our most important hero, a Israeli human rights lawyer. In the very first week, he wrote in Haaretz, and he said, the reaction of Israel must take place within the limits of international law. This was never heard. This was never taken into account here. And we will have all of us will have to pay the bill for that. Ms. Hilberg also would like to talk about some other topics, but, you know, Germany and Europe will have to bear the brunt and bear the consequences of neglecting the situation. And that also means you have to put your own interests last, because, you know, you need international law to combat pandemics and climate change. Of course, the states of the global south are not going to accept us if the West only uses international laws when it's in their interest. It's not just American exceptionalism, it's Western exceptionalism, and they know it. And it's not only here and now that international law is devalued. And I see no actor in the current German government that would insist on entering into alliances with Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Trump abolishes U.S. foreign aid, and the very same week, there are calculations that it will cost millions, tens of thousands of lives, and no single European country came up with a solidarity declaration. No European country stood up and said, we are going to step in. This is what we need. Ms. Krieger, I'm still undecided if Trump creates damage or destroys everything. Then we need alliances with progressive states, Senegal, Ghana, India, South Africa, I mean, Indonesia. And there are countries where we have human rights violations, but we have to sort of go halfway and meet these states, and Germany is not doing anything in that respect. Let me say that Germany must find new partners. I mean, we cannot just quarrel here in the West, but the West quarrels and the Western construct might crumble. It's coming to an end, and this is what we are seeing. We see the governments in Hungary, we see the president in Poland, we see the government of Israel and Trump in the US. A common kind of Western construct is crumbling. And the West has for a long time been the guardian of this international law, rule-based order. And this is, of course, not only the criticism from the global South, it's also the pressure we feel in the West. And that is why, indeed, we need new alliances with the states that still want to uphold this international system. Still, there are also many other threats. We have AI, we have drone wars, we have climate change, and all these things where we need alliances for. Is international law developing to embrace all of that? And what do you think about the need of new alliances? I mean, the law is applicable, is available. There are not many gaps. I would make an exclusion. Of course, there is the law ad bellum, the right to self-defense. Neither drones nor AI need new laws. They need a consistent application of the laws that we already have. When we look at the broader geopolitical context, let me say that when values get under pressure, when values are being fragmented, when values are suspected of promoting neocolonialism, then the law is so important because the law is a consensus. It's a minimum standard that all the states have agreed to. And all the states, sovereign states, have said, yes, we are going to join, we are going to support this law. Of course, the law must be supported by power politics. And now in the United States, we see three power centers in international relations. And none of these three states, what are the three centers of powers? USA, China, and Russia. And none of these three states, the great powers, so to say, automatically apply the international law and use automatically international organizations. So the future of a rule-based order clearly depends on whether we are going to see a fourth center of power emerging. That would then support the primacy of law and defend international law. And here Europe has a decisive role to play. Of course, Europe cannot walk it alone. We need new coalitions, but first of all, we must learn to speak in one voice. We must be more independent from the United States in terms of our defense capacities, and we must firmly base ourselves on international law. If we can do that, we have a hope for a rule-based order. But if we have internal conflicts within Europe, if states like Germany are not compliant with international law, then they are losing diplomatic power of action, and that is, of course, a very bad sign. The geopolitical situation at the moment is so important, and of course, Germany's position must be consistent. New alliances, Mr. Mijatovic, and finding partners everywhere in the world, not the classical ones that we usually think of and that we see as our eternal allies. What is your discussion in the party or in the Human Rights Council? When it comes to international law and international criminal law, we are going to have a special summit in New York in the beginning of July. We need a change of the Rome Statute. We need a two-thirds majority, and we here in politics would like to rally the states, talk to the states in Africa, so we get it. The problem is not the West. The problem is, of course, Paris and London. I mean, who has stopped committing crimes in the United States never changed their position very much. It was the same under Bill Clinton. Of course, he put it on the table and he signed it. I mean, they say that Bill Clinton left two documents to George W. Bush. One was the ICC accession, and the second one, the Kyoto Protocol. I do believe the Kyoto Protocol might have been there, but the ICC, I'm never so sure about that. And of course, Trump throws it all away. And in 2005, there was the Hague Rescue Acts. So the resistance of Washington against international criminal law, giving international law supremacy over national law and the Supreme Court, this has never happened. And there are also resistance in Europe. So we do have an opportunity to develop international criminal law. But of course, it's a question of division of tasks and powers as well. Syria, Koblenz, Frank, and Berlin. A lot of evidence was collected. Do we make evidence available for other proceedings? Has it all been transcribed? Has it been translated into English, if it was not original English? It costs a lot of money, but it's very important because the Hague courts will not be able to deal with all the cases simultaneously. It's not just our international criminal laws. There are also other laws that can't be used in order to instigate proceedings against criminals. So I am against the accusation coming from Ms. Dill saying that Germany gave up doing something. I don't think it is true. I would rather say we do have a fragile human rights system and we are going to lose it. When we talk about alliances, it looks like civil society is much more efficient and effective in creating networks. How about international law? Is it still a task of governments? I mean, international law was meant to be a legal framework for state actors to abide by and apply. Don't you think that international law is also a task of civil society? What's the role of human rights organizations, for instance, groups like Amnesty or so? They now write long reports on genocide, hundreds of pages. They use international law. They employ many lawyers. What is the role of civil society?
Well, in any case, it's very important, and that's also the progress, because, as you said, Ms. Krieger, international law is a language, a blueprint, which includes human rights, cultural rights, which were discovered quite late in Germany. There are an utopian potential, and that is why this is a common basis of understanding. And in the last 25 years, a lot has happened in this respect. At the beginning, there were just individual lawyers who were haunting Pinochet and the Argentinian dictators, and some networks were formed. And all of a sudden, human rights came in, and also supply chain law, which is actually the idea that the meaning of that is that you should externalize responsibility, and to take this back and to talk about that a company selling goods here or distributing things or buying raw materials from somewhere else, that this company should be responsible for human rights violations along the whole supply chain. This is incredibly important, and it's also something which went down in the entire world. human rights activists in the whole world are relating to that. And the old German government actually had a very sad picture when they came under fire in that. And we have to speak up openly about that. The supply chain law is not the height of all this. And of course, the whole implementation is a big problem, and a lot of bureaucracy is involved. But the idea is so important, and so I would like to hear from the Minister of Economy or Justice or Foreign Relations that, of course, there are things which need improvement, but it has to be clear that in Europe and in Germany, companies based there should also take responsibility if something like that happens outside these countries. And that's what I'm missing. I like this strong fighting for the idea of this Supply Chain Act, even in spite of these needs for development. So what do you think, Ms. Krieger? Is that something which we can just use this law, this international law, to put pressure on certain governments because of this networking? Is there still enough funding for building these networks and maintaining them? Ms. Dill? I have a very positive view on that. I think in the international context, of course, it costs a lot of force, of power to demand this, like international criminal law in the time between the Nuremberg tribunals and the Bohemian Statutes is actually a story where the civil society had played an incredibly important role. And on the other hand, of course, media, academics and foundations are also taking part in this failure of the use. Of course, in Germany, they don't like this idea that they just fell apart of international law, but that's what the outside world thinks. And Germany will notice this, that in other contexts, this return, they will not be considered the champions of international law anymore if they are not consistently following it. And the community has a very important point to exert pressure on governments and to network. And I see this criticism, and I'm a little bit sad about if civil society doesn't take that role. I really do not want to provoke you and bring you back to the subject you want to get away from, but I don't think that Israel politics of Germany would be possible if there wasn't this taboo in German leading media to shed light on this with empathy from the point of view of the Palestinians. That all sources which are really working on the ground as humanitarian players are still taken with a pinch of salt. And this way of involvement with the civil society in not implementing the rule of law shows also the power of the civil society, also the other way around. And that is why I'm voting for a major change where the civil society also reflects on itself. Ms. Krieger, this way of application also leaves the impression that international law is actually an instrument of the powerful against their own enemies, rather than being an instrument for allies, which should be used independently, even against allies. But we also see that the countries of the so-called Global South are now actively using international law. That's the example of South Africa against Israel, or even Nicaragua against Germany. Now also meetings of the International Court of Justice are being transmitted live, and people may watch it. So this gives the impression that there's a kind of a global public publicity for this work. Maybe is this changing your work as a lawyer or as a worker at the university? Do you think that in the light of such globalized readiness to get closer to this, does this create something? Is there any pressure, any awareness to demand international law and its application, or are you more skeptical, where you might be saying, well, they can still watch it, but they will not understand what's going on there? Well, I think there are manifold processes created by that. It may have this political effect, which we have just heard of, in order to come back to that. Also, this is something which also has light and shadow. mainly because the civil society in many of those countries we mentioned today, such as Hungary, have come under pressure. But it's not only in Hungary. There are waves of lawmaking from Russia through Venezuela and up to Australia, where the work of the civil society, of political foundations abroad, has been considerably restricted, and the special spearheading country, which is the risk for autocratic systems. This is something autocrats are very well aware of, and that's why they are also working against NGO very massively. This wording of shrinking spaces has widely been used in that context. And this is, of course, the downside, not only in Germany, but in other places. But maybe also in Germany, we always had a little question on NGOs. I wouldn't mention that now simultaneously the Atlas of the Civil Society by Brot für die Welt and other NGOs is now being published, and Germany has been criticized. It was criticized last year already just because of the repressions against climate activists. And if you just use force and police force against climate activists, this is of course questionable. And of course what's concerning now the solidarity with Palestine is also a problem. And I do not want to compare this even because there is no risk of dying in Germany, while in other countries you are at risk for your life if you go to rallies. But as Ms. Still has just said, you cannot just promote freedom of the press and freedom of expression and take in the Sakharov Prize and to just award opposition people from the other countries while not where people who are criticizing their own government are being restricted in their freedom of expression and freedom of demonstration. So what is your take on this role of this civil society? Heinrich-Böll Foundation, of course, has some partner organizations on the ground who are coming under pressure, who also try to explain what Germany is discussing and what it's doing politically, who are turning their back on Germany. And those organizations now have to fight with that situation. They don't even want to accept money from Germany anymore because they are going against this politics of Germany. I would like to come back to international criminal law because these ad hoc tribunals, especially on former Yugoslavia, without these international laws wouldn't be thinkable. Human rights who really brought about evidence on the genocide in Srebrenica, where evidence was also found by responsible people, by joint criminal enterprise. That was really a big deal for those who are inside. Well, can you explain this? It was kind of an American model. If somebody is committing a crime and 5 others are witnessing, they are all responsible because they all have committed this crime as a gang. And the question is then, what is the law under which we should judge these criminals in Yugoslavia? And it was very creative how they went about that. And as I understood it, it came right from science. And that is how we can, of course, also use this contribution by the civil society in order to fill international criminal law with life. And now your question, political foundations are now getting a lot of questions because funding from other sides is fading away, especially organizations of the civil society. I'm seeing Walter Kaufmann. We will have to speak about Serbia very soon because they have come under pressure. This is an organization of Serbian media who are showing very well how the media are being used by these authoritarian systems, who are also doing surveys and opinion poll observations, who really uphold democratic values from our point of view, but at the end of the day are coming under massive pressure and are financially dried out. At the end of the day, the German political foundations will not be able to support them. We will definitely need new alliances, and I agree with you about the fourth pole. So we have to think of how we can protect the German single market when it comes to the standards of the supply chains. That's actually our standard. We have so many products as that may be furniture or that may be clothing. And there is a very strong lobby which is coming up with arguments which should not prevent us from trying to impose the Supply Chain Act again. Well, it was a backlash, but have been a politician for so long, and so I'm not giving up yet. So we are still striving for implementing such a law. We are now about to open this round for the public. You mentioned the fourth global center of power. Is actually Europe suitable, looking at its own colonial history or the history of the last decades, wars in Iraq, UK, France, how they dealt with Algeria? Is Europe actually suitable as a fourth center of power in the field of upholding the international law, etc.? Well, if they would just give up its attitude of supremacy, it would be very helpful already. I still remember the visit of an Indian journalist who that was not under Ms. Baerbock, who had been invited by the Foreign Office for a workshop, and he called and said, "Sorry, I have to speak to a normal person again because they are so much getting on my nerves. They are behaving so kind of supreme, like being champions of human rights, and they do not really perceive how the rest of the world thinks about them, and they are not able to listen." And that, of course, also needs that you have to recognize that colonialism, and not just individual episodes of colonialism, that colonialism itself was a crime, and that colonialism until today has had very severe impacts on these countries, among other things also on the climate situation in the world. For example, that has been discussed, Haiti, for example, to some extent. And something needs to be done there. But I can't see that. I cannot see France recognizing what they did to this very poor country, Haiti, which was the first country to get rid of colonial power. And France demanded damages from them. And what that did to this country, it would be more than just to release these debts or to pay back a major portion of that, simply in order to save the world climate to a certain extent. But I don't see any attempt from politicians in France and in other countries in that sense. And certainly that will be in their way as long until they really wake up. And again, the pandemic. You asked me before about networking, international context, etc. You do not believe what I saw, what was told during the pandemic in Latin America about the behavior of Germany, just preventing them from vaccines or sticking to vaccine patents, etc. It was a global threat, and one could have stood up saying, we are developing these vaccines and we are providing them to the world, we are providing them with manufacturing capacities for this. And the poorest, again, were ones who suffered most. We in Germany are just standing up and we speak for a general release of the debt for the 50 poorest countries, because it's good for international climate and for international health, because it's only as weak as the weakest element. But I did not see any party coming up with such idea, calling themselves leftists or others. None of the parties took the initiatives in that respect, and I believe that's the key to the future, and that's also important for credibility of a fourth pole, which is more than just a pole of power. Thank you. On the one hand, you should think of your own historical injustice. And now we are going to collect your questions. First one is coming up already that I would like to ask. The first 3 questions. Let's take 3 questions. There's a mic in the room.
Genau, dort hinten war ein...
Over there were 3 persons who had raised their hands. Let's give the floor to the lady first, and then the gentleman over here. I'm Annika Heiland from CARE. Thank you for this discussion, and thanks to Boris Mijatovic for coming here. But I have to make a few comments. One must say I do not have empathy for the Palestinian population in Gaza and the humanitarian personnel on the ground. Mr. Bojatovic has listened to that. We do not have any channels to talk about what happens in Gaza. Many people are still providing aid in Gaza. And let me say, over 400 killed humanitarian helpers, over 300 medical personnel killed. And the humanitarian helpers, they were interested only when the first 6 international helpers were shot dead. But over 200 humanitarian local helpers had already been killed before that. I am against the argument that the German government kept up this position in order to allow humanitarian access. It's simply not true. We didn't get any lorry more into the Gaza Strip after the talks. The talks took place, but even if you talk to people from the Foreign Office or even the Chancellor's office, they said they hardly have any influence at all. And we would have wanted to see a change of the position much, much earlier in the interest of people living there and all our... Do you have a question? It's a question that I have, and it concerns the ICC's accusation against Germany for aiding and abetting in genocide. That is to say, the complaint filed by Nicaragua. I would like to hear about the experts' position regarding this complaint. I have a question to Janina Dill, because she talked about the right of self-defense as one of the areas of international law that needs to be adjusted. What exactly did you have in mind? And in how far do you think the international law must be adjusted in order to become more resilient and resistant to the collapse of the global order that we are seeing around us? Thank you to the Böll Foundation. It's a very interesting event. I have a question to you, Mr. Mijatovic. You said no matter what Germany sent in terms of weapons to Israel, that would be fatal. I would say it's just the other way around. And Germany should send the signal we keep up international law, and our allies and friends that are violating international law will no longer be supported by us. And that would also send a signal to the enemies of Israel. You will be confronted with the same situation. If you do not respect international law, we will impose consequences. So maybe you can respond to that note from the perspective of the Green parties. I would like to know what is the concerns that the German government has. The Palestinian population wants to see a reaction coming from Germany. Other European partners have done that already. Now, maybe, Mr. Jatovic, how about humanitarian aid? That you started acting too late. Probably you know the figures already, and maybe it would be more consistent not to deliver weapons anymore. Fears and concerns is not the case. I said, what is the political consequence if we stop weapons exports, arms exports? That could mean that Tehran steps up uranium enrichment, and they can send 500 kilograms to Israel with a drone. That's a bit rough in terms of an answer, but indeed, we have already said that the use of weapons must be in conformity with international law. And that is why we have the complaint of the ICC. I mean, I do not defend what Israel is doing. We just have to be aware of the political consequences of such decisions. Although there is a legal problem. And I don't want to endanger Israel's right of existence, and I don't want to fear in internal politics. Of course, it's a government that violates things. It's a government that I am even calling right-wing. But still, we need a strengthening of institutions. And if we stop delivering weapons, would that be the right sign? I'm not so sure about it. We have accusations against Katz and Netanyahu, but we also have to think of the collateral damage of any decision we take. Mrs. Heinlein, I talked to the Special Commissioner of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a very tough department to talk to. I don't think we have not had any success at all, because I know that the whole team and Annalena did a good job. They tried as much as they could, and at the end of the day, we see our aim was not reached. The blockade for 90 days, ever since the 2nd of March, it's a total failure, showing that nothing we did before had any effect. And this total failure is there, and we need to find answers. And here I have expectations to the new German government. And I do think that Annalena has started a good course. The criminal complaint Nicaragua against Germany, that's a sign that we shouldn't have too high expectations. The proceedings instigated is seen as legally not very firm. Germany has now explained its perspective and has defended itself, focusing very much on the condition precedent of German law. The German government has explained our legal position. Nicaragua wasn't prepared for that. And so therefore, so far the proceedings have been ended in favor of Germany. Of course, Germany wants to have the International Court has not completely removed the proceedings from its agenda, so there could be a second round. And of course, the legal norms can have been violated because of weapon deliveries. And so Germany has also to face the situation that, after all, the proceedings might prevail. And of course, we need to check very clearly which are the weapons we can still deliver to Israel. Right of self-defense, I do agree with Ms. Krieger regarding the Nicaragua proceedings. But I do think a liability risk for Germany is very high, especially when Germany decides now to deliver more weapons. The right of self-defense. According to Section 51 of the UN Charter, there is the right of self-defense, and there are a number of open doctrines, like, for instance, if the attack comes from a non-state actor, like Hamas, and not so much Hezbollah, but there are so many non-state actors that work transnationally. If they start an armed conflict, does that mean you have the right to self-defense according to international law? The other question that is even more virulent is the question, what is proportionality on this level? There's always the principle of proportionality in international humanitarian law, but it has a very concrete situational application, like an airstrike on a certain object. Now, the question of self-defense and proportionality is still disputed. What does it mean? And all the opinions are not very clearly stated yet. It would be very meaningful to have a consensus. There is a very orthodox traditional position where everything is focused on the severity of the armed conflict. Like, for instance, self-defense must be in proportion with the level of the attack committed. But there are also more moral argumentations that say it's all about the damage that is being inflicted, and their self-defense must focus on what damage they can prevent if they use the right to self-defense. So the doctrine is not very clear. This is maybe not the core of the crisis, but I do think here we need a kind of consensus in the international community. More questions? Maybe from the middle of the room now. We have got 1 or 2 questions. 3 questions.
Ja, hallo, mein Name ist David Durm.
I am David Durm. I work at the board of Grünes Emslands, an organization in Lower Saxony. For me, it's a very painful experience. I had to see during this election campaign that the Green Youth of Emsland collapsed because young people left the Green Party because of the war that Israel is waging.
Ich frage mich wirklich,
So
was ist denn die rote Linie jetzt? Wo
my question is, where is the red line? Where do we say as a party, enough is enough? We are not going to deliver any weapons anymore. When do we start thinking about that? What happens is a disaster. Over 50,000 people were killed already. And here in Germany, I see that my friends accuse me of supporting a party that is delivering weapons to a right-wing extremist government. This is what I get to hear from my friends. And I see that the infrastructure of my party has collapsed because we are no longer credible in terms of upholding the law. And that is why my clear question to you is, where's the red line?
Hi, everyone. I hope that someone can answer me in English, or all of you if you want to. Thank you very much for your time. It has been very interesting. I want to come across a topic that, of course, for the time has not been addressed, and it's about migration. Given the current polarization, radicalization, and rise of the far-right governments in the EU that we have seen, what's the role of international law regarding border policies? And we also have seen a lot of EU treatment, pushbacks, and closed-door policies in all the EU, not only in Germany. And what do you think the international law can do in this case? Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. Das ist eine Frage nochmal mit Blick auf Migration, Pushback.
Thank you. That is a question regarding migration pushbacks and the situation in Europe, human rights-based policy. And we take on board one more question. No, that was not a question. Maybe somebody else wants to ask a question. Okay, over there.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. I'm Katharina Kaspari. I work at Greifswald University and I work on international environmental law. And this is where my question comes from. Today we're talking about the future of international law. We are talking about the prohibition on violence. We talk about international criminal law and international humanitarian law. And it's quite logical because in Gaza and in Ukraine, fundamental norms have been violated. But I have a different question. I see in my work that international law, international environmental law, is being disregarded. We have seen that over decades, but still I see some parts of this international environmental law still are workable. Agreements are being negotiated, BBMJ, for instance, and my question is, maybe we just got used to the fact that this law is being disregarded and it has nothing to do with our fundamental norms. But when we talk about the future of a value-based order, we need to talk about all aspects and all bodies of international law, strengthening international law instead of weakening. Who wants to answer the questions of migration, environmental law, and, of course, the question to our colleague?
Es wäre gut, wenn Sie Deutsch antworten, weil wir haben ja die Übersetzung, kommt ja auf Englisch über den Kopfhörer.
So, okay, I would like to address your question on migration. Ms. Krieger mentioned the letter of 9 countries, but it's not the first initiative. We have in Berlin very often, we had visits of the judges of Albuquerque from Portugal, from the International Court of Human Rights, and he said decades ago that the European Convention of Human Rights will be going down by 2 things, one of the suspects of terrorism and migration. And France and UK have announced several times they want to step back from that. Other countries have also taken similar decisions that foreign tribunals should not decide on them. And so for long since, we have not just been talking about right-wing extremist governments, we are actually talking about central governments, be it centristic governments, social democratic governments. One of the worst laws of asylum law and migration law can be seen in Denmark, where they have a social democratic government, and they say they can only succeed in social democratic policy if they are hard on the migration sector. So in Germany, we've got parties of 25% who are right-wing extremists and can inflict a lot of damage. And to me, as an advocate for human rights, who has also claimed a lot in court against pushbacks, for me, it's a very difficult tactical question. On the one hand, it's obvious that one has to form alliances. You have to fight against right-wing extremists. On the other hand, I can see that with this harder migration politics, the right wings are being empowered. You can study this in Austria, where they have been on the rise more and more, even though migration laws have been made more severe. And what is even very bad, which we can see from the judgment of from the ruling of the Administrative Court of Berlin, were 3 Somalian citizens who came to Germany via Poland, and they had been pushed back immediately. And the Berlin Administrative Court has ruled that this violates European law. This is, of course, arguable, but the interesting part is most experts are not arguing, but they are really thinking that the Administrative Court ruled as it would have to be expected, because it's in line with international law. But what I would like to point out in this context is, when talking about erosion of international law, we also have to call upon these politicians in this country who feel that they can just turn their back on international law if it's just in their political interests. And we have to say what they are actually doing. We have to make clear, is there enough contradiction to that? Because we hear a lot of voices who say, well, European Convention of Human Rights, well, if interpretation of the laws is not to our liking, we have to change the law. So what are we actually changing the agreements? Yes, one could do so. But do you think it's enough being done? But you mentioned this earlier. Protection of human rights, of course, mainly refers to the vulnerable groups, to minorities, and one of the most vulnerable groups on European soil are refugees. And we talked about Syria in the Koblenz proceedings, which we mentioned earlier. One of the side claimants is representatives of the Assad regime, who stood up and said, I was violated twice in my rights. Twice I became the object of state violence. Once it was in Syria, of course, much more dramatic and much worse. And the second time, when I went to Europe and I was treated at the borders in that way, I was treated. And that shows again what facts we are actually having to discuss. And again, this goes to the parties who are taking part in forming the political will, or should do so at least. In this country, there is 1 million Syrian refugees, and there was a climate of welcoming and understanding. And by the way, also, and that is progress to me, never it was seriously questioned that survivors of torture in Syria would call upon German prosecutors and law and judges and tribunals. Well, there is a fruitful soil on which politics could be made. And I missed that over the recent years so dreadfully. And the story is told about many women from Syria, and a lot has been told. And there was this empathy, exactly, which otherwise is missing in the debate, because frequently that's something to do with foreign alliances and who is friend, who is foe, and what is then being treated in German laws. Tribunals, sorry, about environmental law. International environmental law. Certainly that's a very important observation which puts into the focus the question, how is international law going to develop? Are we going to see some sectorial differences where certain parts and areas will survive, where law is being observed because it serves certain interests, also in the businesses, etc., so that this decomposition takes place only in cases where the state interests are affected, while in other areas rights can still be upheld. But on the other hand, I'm sorry to come back to Trump again. Trump government just in May released an executive order where unilaterally they just said goodbye to deep sea mining, and they sold the first mining licenses unilaterally in their own jurisdiction. And you see that, and I'm afraid to say, where major players really take to illegality, it will expand and will, in the end, involve all areas. Thank you, Mr. Mijatovic. Do you want to say something about the alienation of the young Greens? Well, just I would like to elaborate on that. This is exactly why we would need these polls, and not just because it's nice, because from Europe, if we do not defend our own values from Europe, this illegality will spread needlessly or seamlessly. I don't know how many laws are being ignored by China and rulings of the International Maritime Court. There are, of course, some major tasks. We also did not discuss Myanmar, where a military junta is flying air raids on hospitals, and I did not hear about any outcry. And it's not easy to me to sit here and to just say yes to everything. And I was one of the first ones who, in this new mandate 2021, met Philip Lazzarini and Umbra. In parts of our parliamentary group and of the party, they had a very back standing, and it's like this until today. And I was frowned upon because I supported them. Why do you support Hamas? They asked me, and it was long before the 7th of October. And I'm really taken aback by seeing that a UN organization who has been confirmed every 3 years is discredited so much by Israel. Well, that should be one red line. UNRWA should get funding. Well, employment is, of course, a question. All the documents automatically go to the Israel security services as well. So the new people who had been convicted now, they also went through the pause of the Israel catches over the years. And so we are now seeing this Middle East conflict. We should focus on what we cannot do. Maybe we did not get through enough trucks, but we tried at least, and we tried to repair these trucks when they were broken down. And every Friday we have debates on that. We also discussed Saudi Arabia very intensively 2 years ago. I think as a Green Party, we were able indeed to really straighten our back and to stand up against crimes against humanity, also to restrict armament, weapons exports, etc. Especially the GS debate in the last 2 years has shown how torn about we are and how often we discussed it in all our programs and manifestos, how often we question these things. We tried to stand up for humanity and order. The question is, if you think Dublin is bad, I think it's a disaster, then of course you have to think how you can solve this at the European level, and that you get a lot of detailed questions at the European external borders, and that can be taken down. Parts of the party did so, and that is why we are so much discussing today. So I would like you to get into dialogue with you. But unilateral blaming is not good. No, that was no blaming. It was just a reflection from its basis that many young people were. So sorry, I did not mean it. In the debate, if we are unilaterally discussing it in the debate, it's too easy for us. We take it. The same goes for weapons export. It's not easy, and I'm not interested in just arming all the world. And I do not want to have the strongest conventional army in Europe. I would like to think more European, but it's a long way to go for us. So that can be discussed in a bilateral conversation later. Now, Ms. Dill, I would like to say one thing about weapons export. Now, Ms. Dill and Mr. Padek, one sentence about weapons exports. Basically, there was a proceeding at the administrative court in Berlin. It was not the problem whether weapons exports are against international law or not. The problem there was that no one actually knew what had been supplied at the moment, and that we, as a claimant, actually had just stuck or groped in the dark. And at the end, at least the administrative court asked the German government, and it turned out that no war weapons are being supplied, and there's nothing in the pipeline either. Whereas in the administrative court in Frankfurt, it was different. We also were groping in the dark, and the reserve officer as the chairman of the court threatened us if we did not know who supplies. It's just the 100 companies who should be taken to court, and they would all bring their lawyers, and we checked. It would have been a risk of €1 million for us. And the problem was not whether it was against international law or not, but in that case, the whole transparency of weapons export are the problem. If we do not know in advance, we cannot claim, and if we claim afterwards, it doesn't make any sense. Ms. Dill, I just would like to elaborate on the last two questions, because environmental law was a very important point. It works quite well, and we just don't see it. This is the kind of coordination problem what was solved, and we have been focusing so much on the international law, which is trying to solve politically difficult problems, and that is kind of a selection bias. Of course, international law is serious, and the crisis is real, but there are some positive sides indeed. And of course, the first statement which was made here by the gentleman who is part of the Greens, this alienation tells me, and it's important to hear from Mr. Mijatovic that you're having this debate, and there is some argument also within the party. But if you really look at the outcome in politics, this statement expresses to me that the problem right now is those who are on the right side in the political spectrum are historically perhaps not on the right side. And this is not bearable, not sustainable in the long run in our society. Thank you for that statement. I would like to add one thing about environmental law, because we are seeing in Ukraine how the Russian Federation is committing massively environmental crimes. The Kakhovka dam was one of the examples. There are lots of ecocide attempts to destroy the environment there. And also we have to see how that can also be defined as war damage. There are databases built up by the Ukrainians, and we are also in a debate to expand our international law in order to be able to prosecute these crimes. I'm looking at my watch. There are 2 minutes left. Is there one urgent question from the audience? And then we will have a final round very briefly, 1 minute each one, if we are allowed to extend a little bit. Kaiser Geiser, the urgent question is the urgency of this day. We see a ship which is now starting from Sicily to Gaza, and I would like to get the answer from the legal expert what this ship, this vessel with Greta Thunberg on board, where many people in social media are now mocking about her. What does she have to do there? Gaza is also an environmental problem, maybe an even larger one than Ukraine, because it's completely destroyed. And I do not know how many generations cannot do anything there as regards nature or food production, etc. So just this one question to the panelists. What is the threat to such a vessel? And the other question, what I do not really understand, probably you mentioned assistance to genocide. Is there any obligation to humanitarian aid or assistance? And is that legally binding for the member states of the European Union, for example? Or if so, why isn't it done? Thank you.
A short round of answers. Who wants to start? Maybe Ms. Dill.
Und ich meine vielleicht, ja, bitteschön.
There is an obligation of warring parties to allow humanitarian aid into the region. That is to say, there's also an obligation not to arbitrarily refuse such access rights. It does not mean that there is a perfect duty of all states to provide humanitarian aid, but that's part of the problem of humanitarian aid, that we, namely the international system as such, are drying out financially humanitarian aid. That includes Germany, that also includes France, UK or Italy, and the American. Annika Heinlein would even know more about it. We had 30 million. We need 30 million for humanitarian aid. Not even half of that amount is indeed available, and it's a long-term question. When 2 or 3 years ago, food program asked me what is the situation, we had to say we have food only for 2 continents, but we have 3 continents to take care of. What happens to the ship? Well, I guess it will be stopped either by the Lebanon or Israeli fleets and will not be allowed into the military restricted area. But that's my assumption. What do you think will happen to a ship on board of which there is a problem? There is a person that is a climate activist but doesn't do humanitarian or civil society aid. I am neither Greta Thunberg nor the Israeli government. Let them answer the question. Let me just say one thing regarding development of new legal provisions in terms of environmental law and ecocide. Much of what is happening in Ukraine and Gaza is already covered by existing standards and norms of international law. We have an application deficit. So it's not about new norms, it's about their use, and that also concerns aggression. Of course, it might be a nice idea to increase the level of criminal responsibility for new forms of crime like ecocide, but if you do not have enough instruments and tools to apply the law that we already have, it doesn't make sense. Let me make my final statements. In that context, I would like to re-emphasize that for Germany, it's a question of identity, namely to stand up consistently for international law. It is a question of Germany's identity to refrain from using double standards. When we think about what's our identity as Germans ever since we created the basic law, the Constitution, it's an identity that was always characterized by compliance and legal principles. Giving up all of that, I think, would have a disastrous, a devastating effect. That was precisely the right closing statement for tonight's discussion. Let me thank our panelists. Thank you for listening. Thank you to the interpreters. And I also wish you a nice evening.